Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Elash. The Mar-a-Lago talks between Trump and Zelenskyy ended with cautious optimism, marred slightly by what appears to be Russian meddling in the form of allegations of Ukraine trying to attack Putin's mansion with drones. Yet even apart from that, there is still details to be hammered out. What security guarantees will Ukraine receive and for how long? How to monitor the truce so that Russia doesn't try to circumvent it? And how to get Moscow to sign on to reasonable proposals such as foreign peacekeeping contingents, which it somehow still considers to be deal breakers. Joining us here today is Professor Scott Lucas, lecturer in American Studies at University College Dublin. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you.
And Happy New Year to you as well. So, looking at the situation that we're in right now, following the talks at Mar-a-Lago, do you think this cautious optimism is justified?
I think you can say there are positive signs for Ukraine and its European partners, but we need to start that by saying we're not talking about an end to the Russian invasion, simply because Vladimir Putin doesn't want to end that invasion and doesn't want to negotiate over a halt. He just wants to seize more territory. What is positive out of those latest talks in Florida? First of all, over the past 2 months, Ukraine and Europe have pushed back what was an ultimatum that had been devised by the Kremlin with two of Donald Trump's key advisors, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. And that would have forced the surrender of all of the Donetsk region. It would have kept Ukraine politically and militarily weak with no meaningful security guarantees, and it would have devoted 50% of the profits from Ukraine's reconstruction fund to the U.S. Now, all of that has been sort of pushed to the side as Ukraine and Europe have pushed forward their counter proposals. And what they have gotten is a commitment by the Americans to participate in security guarantees. Now, at this point, Trump is only saying those security guarantees will be for 15 years. Zelenskyy and the Europeans are asking for up to 50 years, but at least the principle is there. Now, what are the issues that remain? The status of Donetsk is still unclear. Ukraine and Europe are now focusing on the idea of a demilitarized economic zone, but both Ukraine and Russia have to pull back, not just Ukraine. And Trump hasn't signed on to that yet. Secondly, we need clarity around that reconstruction process, how it's to take place, that this should be for Ukraine, not for American profits. And thirdly, in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, we need confirmation that control over it will not be split between Moscow, Washington, and Ukraine, but that it will remain under Ukrainian sovereignty, even if it may be run by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
So, of course, this remains to be seen, right? What is going to be agreed upon in this regard? But isn't this a bit of a slightly, disturbing reflection that we're facing? That we used to talk about Ukrainian victory. And arguably, Ukraine could have actually pushed Russians out had there been more support on the ground with weapons and stuff. I'm not talking about, troops essentially going into Ukraine, but I'm just essentially talking about like much greater military aid than was provided. And now we're treating this rather convoluted arrangement with a free trade zone in parts of the Donbass as something of a success, because the bar was set very low with, the Russian demands for giving them away the fortress belt that Ukraine had established.
No, I think there are 2 points. I think the first, going back to 2023, is that while recognizing the bravery and resilience of Ukraine, that the failure of the counteroffensive in Zaporizhzhia, in the south, and beyond Kharkiv, going further into Donetsk and Luhansk in the east, that was a huge setback. And that occurred, of course, under the Biden administration. I acknowledge that part of the limits on that Ukrainian counteroffensive was because the Americans were too slow, too restrictive in the equipment they provided. But I think we have to acknowledge that. But the second and the real immediate problem this year is the Trump administration. Remember at the start of this year, we faced the prospect that in a movement led by the Vice President J.D. Vance, which I can speak more about in a moment because of new information, the U.S. was completely abandoning Kyiv. No more military aid, whether by grants or by sales, no more intelligence sharing, and direct negotiations between Washington and Moscow. Now, Ukraine and Europe and the international community have pushed that back. I think for several months, the Ukraine government, and it's not an optimal situation, but I think they recognize the landing point here is that there will be a short-term Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine, that has to be accepted given the military situation, but that you get support for the rest of Ukraine, more than 80% of Ukraine, to develop politically, economically, and militarily, and that position of strength, which will include eventually EU membership, is sort of a beacon for the rest of Ukraine to one day be liberated.
So overall, it's not complete justice and closure for many of the victims of Russian war crimes, but at least Ukraine has a chance of surviving as a sovereign nation. Now, you've mentioned new information coming to light in this regard. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, the New York Times has a detailed expose which they're featuring. It's almost like a review of the year of the Trump administration and its approach to Ukraine. And what is striking is that at the start of the administration, and we knew some of this, but this puts it together, the Vice President J.D. Vance led the effort to abandon Ukraine. He put his own handpicked officials into the Pentagon, into other agencies, to try to prevent those agencies from maintaining their assistance. Think about the military support, think about intelligence support, think about diplomatic support. Then he took the envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, who was developing a plan for negotiations while maintaining the defense of Ukraine, and he issued the command. Kellogg could talk to Kyiv, he could talk to the Europeans, but he could not talk to the Russians. That would be something that Vance controlled. And who's the person who was chosen to talk to the Russians? The real estate developer, Steve Witkoff. The Kremlin immediately courted Witkoff. They had done psychological profiles, they knew his vulnerabilities, and they dangled the prospect of U.S.-Russian economic deals before him through Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, Kirill Dmitriev. In other words, J.D. Vance gave the Kremlin an opening. They took full advantage of that, and for several months, they used that, as you show those images on your screen, not only to cripple support of Ukraine, but to hold open the prospect of a full embrace of Vladimir Putin.
So why do you think there is such a strong opposition towards, not even helping Ukraine in a way that we have today, essentially Europe paying for the weapons and the US continuing to provide them? But from what you're saying, there seemed to be a genuine willingness to sabotage the entire process. Do you think this may lead to some sort of rift in the administration later on, as the objectives that Trump may have and that J.D. Vance may have could actually be becoming less compatible with one another?
The rift is there now. J.D. Vance, from the start of this administration, did not believe in an American alliance with Europe, that alliance that we've had since the early of World War II. He effectively announced that at the Munich Security Conference in February. By the end of this year, through the National Security Strategy document, Vance and his allies have put out the statement that Europe is going to be overrun by immigrants, this great replacement conspiracy theory, this racist conspiracy theory. Therefore, Europe must have far-right governments that are put into power. The EU must be broken up. NATO must not be supported, certainly not through expansion. Because Vance does not believe in a priority for European and Ukrainian security, it risks the future of Kyiv. But that's not the end of the story, because another faction in the administration, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and many career officials, they don't want to see an end of that alliance. They won't want to see the U.S. abandon Europe. So they are the ones that continue to maintain the space, not only for Ukraine and Europe to push forth these proposals, but to get meaningful steps, such as the American sanctions on Russian oil companies that took effect last month.
So what do you think this is likely to lead? Because we do have Donald Trump at the very center now. He is more of an old-school member of the American establishment, but he is not a traditional Republican either. So it's, between Trump, between, the sort of alt-right movement that wants to reshape the entire structure of national security and alliances and all that, and the more traditional part of the Republican Party. How is this going to end? Which side is Trump going to choose? Or is he, planning to play them against one another for his own personal benefit?
This is a marathon, not a sprint. Donald Trump is a weather vane. He spins according to the last person who talked to him and according to what he thinks will profit Donald Trump. He doesn't know much about Ukraine. His interest is not Ukraine. His interest is not Europe. So what do Ukraine and Europe have to do? They know that Russia is not going to stop the invasion. So they have to maintain the diplomatic talks. They have to flatter Trump while getting to the adults in the room in the United States. They have to maintain the American support for sanctions, especially the sanctions on Russian oil. They have to maintain the pressure with American support of Ukraine's counterattacks inside Russia, and they have to maintain the support led by the Europeans, but also needing the Americans for the finance to maintain Ukraine's government, its society, and all those civilians who bravely resist. Again, as we go into 2026, a reminder that despite everything thrown at it by the second largest military in the world, despite all the propaganda, all the deaths, all the destruction, and despite the Trump administration, Ukraine still stands. Its government still stands. Its people still stand.
So it's a testimony to Ukrainian resilience. Also, we should add that some commentators noted J.D. Vance wasn't in the room in Mar-a-Lago. Perhaps that might be a sign, at least for the time being. Professor Scott Lucas was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Milan Szrewiński. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.